I'm here. Still getting set up. Obviously, we're playing around with the ukulele for a second, but we'll get going shortly. Just need to pull up this guy over here. Oh no, I forgot to change the name of my stream. Let me go do that while I got you guys waiting. Well, no one showed up yet, so that's fine. Alright, now we should be back in session. I'll have to fix that later. We back? Yeah, there we go. Alrighty. Hey everybody. Anybody? Hope everyone's doing alright. If you're here while we're live, obviously I hope you're doing well. If you're watching later, still hope you're doing well. Still have our photo for support up here from the office. It's the Michael Scott Paper Company up there, giving us a little bit of hope today. Put the bill up on my hat. That feels right today. The weather's nice. It's really pretty here in Chattanooga, which is wild considering the weather that we just had, where it was a tornado just ripped through. But we've got crews obviously working on that. It's good to have a nice weather day. What am I going to do today? Let's talk woodworking joinery. Why are we doing this? I miss having a studio. Miss it pretty bad. Miss it pretty desperately. The room that I stream in is a closet. What you can't see off screen right here is that you're actually in the corner of a small storage space. You see the back corner of the wall behind me. This is the far wall, and I can reach my hand out my open door right here. So we're working with what? What's a wingspan on a human as tall as a person? So that's about 5 feet 10 inches. This way is all we got. I've got to curl my finger, so probably closer to just 5 feet. I think if I laid down in here, I'd be hanging out of it a little bit. And I have a small setup that I've got here. I've got a small setup that I've got here that works for like noodling around a little bit. When we first moved in, I tried to get in here and start making things as soon as possible. Showed off some little like toys that I'd carved yesterday. Here's a guy that I started off making when we moved in. Kind of lost steam on him. It's a skeleton guy. Just fitting. I should have shown him yesterday since we drew that skateboard skeleton man. The body is made out of wire. I'm just playing around with. And this head is actually made out of a paper clay that I made What did I put in that paper clay? I know the paper that I actually used was like really low quality toilet paper. That was obviously before all this went down, so there's no like remorse for using really low quality toilet paper as a sculpting material. You boil it in hot water essentially, and it breaks down the fibers. You agitate it to really break it down and get it nice and pulpy. You pull all the water from it, and then you introduce some kind of binding agent. In my case, I just used, I think it was just Elmer's glue, just white glue. And you kind of sculpt from it, and then once it cures, it took several days to cure because this was made solidly out of it. And then you can kind of carve back into it. Those are a lot of fun to do. I would get back into that, but I would feel bad about buying up toilet paper just for sculpting purposes. But I just want to talk woodworking joints. That's what I want to do today. I want to sketch out some joints and play, because I miss woodworking, and this is the closest that I can get to it right now. If I organize this little closet a little bit better, I could maybe get into some very small woodworking projects, but it would be difficult in here. So let's just start talking about wood first. Wood as a material. Let's draw a block. Wood, we know, is organic, right? Comes from trees. Trees grow like this, right? And you got a tree up here, and you have branches. Now, most lumber that you would use for an actual woodworking part is not going to come from the branches. You can do some green woodworking with those higher up chunks of wood, like a bunch of spoon carving is done from the crook of trees. Different things like that. But as far as like big board lumber, it obviously can't come from branches. Branches typically aren't big enough around. So our lumber typically comes from the trunks of trees. If you imagine this tree is a tube, yeah, with branches and all that, the way that water is carried from the ground up into the tree to provide it with the proper amount of energy to pull photosynthesis, right, to get its leaves working with the sun, is it's a system of capillaries that, if you can imagine, the example that's always been given to me in every intro class, which I've only had one intro to woodworking class because that's really all you need, but the example that I use when I would teach intro classes is to imagine that the trunk of a tree is made up of straws, like drinking straws, right? And that's how the liquid is pulled up through the trunk and into the branches, into the upper boughs of the tree. Why is that important when you're talking about wood as a material? Because that grain, that upward striation of capillaries, is called grain, and that has to do totally with the strength of wood as a material. So wood is ridiculously ridiculously strong across the long grain. That's what we call this big collection of those long striations of capillaries. It's called long grain. So if you see a piece of wood like this, then I've drawn long grain up at the top and on the side, and this little like rounded bit over here is called short grain, which is really a bunch of really tiny little holes to pull moisture, just like that. So taking this block here is like comparing it over here. It's like taking that cylinder and making it into a block. Right? So that's easy enough. Across the long grain, that's where you really get your strength out of wood. This is like a really weird bicep that didn't turn out too well. It's because I made the shoulder huge and the actual bicep is tiny. There, big, strong, meaty fist. Oh, long grain strong. If we were to, let's make an imaginary cut here. That would give us a little chunk of wood that looks something like this. And because we had severed its connection with the rest of this long grain stretching that way, it would be really easy to snap this thing across the grain right there. Just, it'd be really, really, really easy. Because wood becomes really brittle across short grain. It'd be really easy just to snap it into like this. Sometimes, especially on YouTube, because it's fun to make videos, you'll see a lot of people that are doing woodworking projects, and it's good that they're experiencing something and trying something new, but they kind of forsake the rules of long grain and short grain quite a bit. If something looks all right for a time, but you go to sit on it and it fails, then that's a problem. So if I was going to build a chair, right? There's a front leg, there's the other front leg. If I was going to build this chair, I would want to make the seat out of a combination somehow of long grain, either going front to back or side to side. It would depend on the style of chair you're making. Usually it's with the grain going front to back. Because if you stacked up a bunch of this short grain, even though you may come up with a really cool pattern, these would have to be little chunks glued up, you'd come up with a really neat pattern for the seat to have. But if it's too thin this way, then someone's booty is going to sit right on it. They're going to put too much weight. It's been a hard day. Going to put too much weight down, and this seat is going to just crack apart. And they'll wind up with a severe injury on their derriere. So long grain strong, short grain incredibly weak. Those are the big key things when it comes to like understanding what joinery is. Should have explained the word joinery. Joinery is just the way that two things come together. It's the way you put stuff together. We are already familiar with a bunch of different types of joinery in our lives without thinking about it. Needle and thread, right? You bring two pieces of fabric together. These are the weirdest two pieces of fabric in the world. There you go. You bring two pieces of fabric together. The needle and thread. Joinery. One of my favorite examples of joinery that's not actual woodworking is everyone's old pal, the Lego. Right? Lego studs. It's a version of joinery. It's a great, very fun version of joinery. Let's get us the new little sample. Now the name of this joint gets a laugh out of some folks. I understand why. It's a bit sophomoric, but I get it. A butt joint is something that I personally don't think I've ever used in any type of woodworking because it's incredibly weak. Because typically what you're doing is you are taking a board that is long grain, you're taking another board that has its long grain going in the opposite direction, like that, and you're putting glue between those two surfaces, and you are clamping them together. You may be asking yourself, well, why is this weak? Why doesn't this work? It's because all that you have, even with modern adhesives, like our modern glue is pretty good, all that you're left with, though, is this super tenuous connection. It has no mechanical advantage whatsoever. It's taking two surfaces, one with the long grain going nice, and then glue is on short grain right here. So it's not very strong. If it's porous, which we know it to be because it has to have the capillary action to take moisture to the rest of the tree, then it's going to soak up that glue. Some people will argue that you can just put some glue down, a thin coat of wood glue on that short grain, let it soak in, and it will, and then come back in 30 minutes and hit it again. And that works. But you're still left with only an adhesive connection. And it's not going to cut it. The minute that too much force is put down on this joint, a butt joint, away from its little adhesive connection, it's going to snap. And that can happen either if you're putting force down further away from the joint, or in this example that I started drawing down here, if you're pushing from the side. In any way. And that joint will basically just explode. To use the chair example again, if you have a chair leg right there, and you have a chair back, and if you're just using a butt joint for the legs, someone's weight coming down on this will just continue downward, and there's nothing to keep these two, to keep the legs held in by the apron or stretcher, and it's just gonna plummet. Butt joints could be decorative. The only instance where I think I would use a butt joint is I wouldn't. If I had to, if I was like building a set for like a little theater group or something, and it's like if they needed just some quick fake windows for the scenery, I would maybe utilize a butt joint. Still highly unlikely, especially for anything that I'm ever going to sell. I would never use a butt joint. It's just too weak. Which takes us to the miter joint. Now the miter joint, if we were to call a spade, is a butt joint. The only difference is that instead of putting long grain into short grain, which for a butt joint you could do short grain into short grain too, like it makes no difference. If you did long grain here and this was a butt joint and you put glue in between, that is still an incredibly weak connection. A miter joint is a butt joint though. Only difference is that for a miter joint, right here, so if this is a board, right, let's make believe that this is a board, like that. Then a miter joint is where you have two 45-degree angles in a traditional miter joint. Two 45-degree angles. Cut into boards. Because 245s make a 90. That's right. 245s make a 90. And then you're putting glue on the end grain here. So So there's glue between these two layers, and you're gluing that down together so that it looks like this if we're looking at it from above. Like that. Let's give this some depth and dimension. So you have long grain, you've got long grain, and this, that is a miter joint. It's not that strong. If you're doing something incredibly small, use a miter joint. If it's a small box, like if you're doing like a ring box or something, I'm trying to even look in my little studio and find something that's a miter joint, and I've got nothing. There is some furniture in the house that's a miter joint, but if you're going to use a miter for furniture purposes, more often than not, you have to find a way to reinforce that miter joint. Sometimes, let's expand our sketch. If I could stop hitting it. Right, this is a super blown up version of this. You can use what's called splines. Splines are where you come in on a miter. There's several different ways you can do this. You can use a table saw. You could use a router setup too. But splines are where you come through and you cut out a little bit, like a little groove in that miter. Like that. And then you mill out a piece of wood that's thin enough and this gets glued down into that groove that you've cut. So essentially that's making like a very big expanded version of plywood. Plywood is where you take the grain and you stack it up counter to itself in each level. So grain goes this way, level 1, this way, level 2, back to this way, level 3, 4, 5, 6, however many plies you got. That's the way it goes. So a spline is like a big exploded version of that helps reinforce a miter. Because you have grain that is going this way, and then you're taking this spline stock, is what we call it, and you are putting that grain going counter to the grain in the miter. Like that. And it helps to enforce that joint a little bit. You can also do a version of a support. So if we are looking inside right here, you can actually cut a small joint in there if your material is thick enough. So if you have a spline going like this, you can cut something like that. And that can either be hidden within the spline, so it's invisible, so it still looks incredibly clean like this. It's technically another version of a spline. It's also kind of a version of a miter. And all that you're doing is, this is a groove cut into that 45 degree at a 45 degree to the 45. So it's just a groove cut into it at 90. Is that right? If we have a board, cut into it at 90. Yep. No, it'd be cutting into that 45 at 90. So it'd be this way. Nearly had me fooled, miter joint. So if this is hidden internally, then you have grain opposing it that is going in between those two miters, and it's also giving it protection from racking this way. It's giving it a nice, clean little backup buddy in the middle. I like the look of a miter joint. The way that I choose in a lot of furniture that I make, if I'm going to use a miter joint, is I will either do a hidden spline to support it through the middle, or oftentimes my miter joints are, let's do this. Oh no, that's too messy. There we go. Because this is all a miter joint over here. I will actually use, we're not going to get into dados today, so I'll just call it rabbits or dados. I use a groove, so it's look like we're at a cross section of this board right here. It's like we're looking at the end. I will cut a groove in the bottom like that, so I can put a panel, a plywood panel, in up underneath a little tray or box like this. And that plywood is ridiculously stable and ridiculously strong, and it helps to support these miters as well. I'll usually glue that in, maybe put a little tack, pin nails in there, just hold it in place while it's gluing. I've done that quite a bit. Our little TV entertainment center, the drawer that holds the TV itself is a miter like that. Alright, cool. Next joint we're going to talk about is called a mortise and tenon joint. Now, for furniture, the mortise and tenon is probably utilized more than any other joint. It's my favorite. Sorry, my eye's really itchy. Accidentally. There we go. The mortise and tenon joint. Mortise and tenons are ridiculously strong. They're beefy. Let's quickly draw in and define what we're talking about. This is the board. We're set up. We're good to go. Then a mortise is just an interior hole. It's a hole in a block of wood. This is long grain. Something like that. Let's use dotted lines to represent that we're going into the space. Maybe that helps visualize it some. That is a mortise. It's an interior hole. Something like that. A tenon. So if we have a block, I'll draw lightly to set it up. So a tenon is the opposite of the mortise. You can do mortise and tenons in so many different ways. They don't all look like they're going solid like this. second. I need to respond to my wife. Okay, so that's a tenon. It's the opposite of a mortise. So if the mortise goes into the block of the wood, then the tenon is technically cut out of the block of wood, and it goes into the the mortise like that. It's a really weird proportion thing that I've drawn. And then that gets glued. Doesn't have to be glued. Traditionally, typically is. Boom. That's a mortise and tenon joint. Ridiculously strong. But why? Well, it's mechanical. We're getting the advantage of the material itself. We know that wood is extremely strong across this long grain, like we mentioned earlier. And your argument weight may be, but Dill, you now have 3 different surfaces of short grain that you've introduced in this mortise and tenon joint. Yes, you're right, but we have this section of long grain. And these little bits around it, these guys, those are called your shoulders. And what happens when a tenon goes into a mortise is you have so much mechanical protection from racking or twisting or warping in any way, because that shoulder keeps the tenon seated firmly into the mortise. That's why starting out in woodworking, you may not understand what's going on. I sure as heck didn't. And I would have a tenon cut, but maybe I screwed up somewhere along the way, and I actually had uneven shoulders like this. So when I would put that tenon into the joint, there would be a big gap on one side. And that gap was there solely because my shoulders were off. Mortise and tenon does not have to look necessarily like square like I'm drawing it. Often you will see you actually get a better mechanical advantage if your tenon has a shoulder all the way around. The proportions I keep drawing are not quite right either. You kind of want 2/3 is what you're looking for. So if I've got a block that's this big, 2/3 of that should be like taken up in shoulder, and the shoulder arm split in thirds and 10 into thirds. Same goes for the mortise. It should be the opposite third. So mortise should be drawn somewhere there. The mortise and tenon joint, like I said, is utilized a lot. Dowels are technically a form of mortise and tenon. If you are turning something on a wood lathe, then it's obviously you're going to get a better connection, a better fit, and it's going to be more mechanically sound and secure if you turn a shoulder all the way around a piece. So let's see, what would you use that for? Anything. You could use it for like rungs of a chair, drying rack, whatever. Incredibly strong the mortise and tenon joint is. It's wonderful. It can be done in a ton of different ways. You can usually you'll use a table saw to cut your tenons. You could use a router. You could absolutely use a handsaw. You could use a combination of a bandsaw and a nice sharp chisel. You should not ever just use a bandsaw, because a bandsaw, so a table saw is going to give you a perfect clean cut. especially if you're using a good table saw and you get some experience with you. It's going to give you a clean cut. Because all it is it's a blade that stays fixed in space, and you have a shoulder reference in your kind of width of it. But a bandsaw runs like this. It sounds like I'm dunking on the bandsaw. I'm not. It's my favorite shop in the whole tool. Bandsaw runs like this, and there's a blade. It runs in a big band. And its teeth have a tendency, because this blade is much thinner usually, they want to wobble. They want to zigzag a little bit. So if we haven't done our layout, which is a term I should have defined earlier, but it's just when you draw out on a block of wood what you need to cut away. If you haven't done your layout and you take a board to the bandsaw to try to cut a tenon in it, then you're going to get this wobbly shoulder. And who knows, the two sides, it may be like this. Like you could get so far off, it's not even funny. But if we use a table saw and you've checked to make sure things are square, then you're good to go. A mortise can be cut on a mortising machine. They could be cut so many different ways. If you make a nice little router setup, you could use a plunge router to cut your mortises. I actually really enjoy cutting mortises by hand, but the biggest kicker with that is I still have not purchased a set of mortising chisels, which are just chisels with a big old chunk of metal behind them. This is obviously a very chibi-fied version of it, but so the chisels that I have now are still the chisels. The very first chisel I got, these Ashley Isles, I've actually got one now right here. It's my 3/4 inch chisel. It's nice. It does have a good chunk of metal, but mortising chisels are usually going to be, pretty beefy to help support the cut, which is what you need. Otherwise, you could really chip that chisel out, or you could even bend it, which would be awful. But the mortising chisel makes short work of a mortise as well. If you're just using your standard bench chisels like the one I just showed to cut your mortises, then you're going to have a rough go of it a little bit. There's going to be a little bit of worry in the back of your head that you're going to destroy your chisel that you work so hard to sharpen and keep nice and set up. So we've talked about, let's just review real quick. We've done a lot. We talked about long grain and short grain. Talked about butt joints, miter joints. We hit mortise and tenon, the best joint, my favorite. And then we have, let's go to a box joint. Oh, I actually need to go back. So a mortise and tenon is going to happen a lot in furniture, like I mentioned earlier, especially when it comes to chairs, like chair legs into the side aprons. That's where you're going to find a lot of mortise and tenon joints. Tables, all those great things. It's used for taking a board with the grain going vertically, board with the grain going horizontally, and meeting those two together in a very strong way. I should do it 90 degrees. Right? Next, let's talk about box joints. Oh, accidentally. There we go. Box joint. The box joint would be used in situations where you would probably, or where you would see like a miter. So it's used when you're trying to bring two long boards together. Two long grain boards, trying to join them in a fashion to where you can get something vaguely shaped like a box. So cabinets, toolboxes, things like that. That's where you're going to find a box joint. And true to its name, the joints are shaped like boxes. shape something like that. Then you have to have the opposite up here. 2, 8, 4. Oops. Well, I'm getting myself confused along the way. There we go. So those would fit into one another. A la like. So we've drawn it to where this side would come in. So box joints really kind of look a little bit like a zipper. So this would be in grain, in grain, in the grain, in grain, in grain. You need to have the long grain going this way. Box joint. Incredibly strong. An incredibly strong connection. After you get glue under these surfaces, trying to pry them apart this way, you're going to have a hard time doing it. A more advanced / traditional version of the box joint that you may be familiar with is the dovetail. This one, people love to brag about their dovetails because it is a hard joint to cut. Let's imagine our boards this way because it's way easier to draw. I'm going to be honest. So a dove joint is like taking the box joint and getting some angles in there. Historically, when our adhesives weren't as strong, the dovetail was used because it was mechanical. It kind of wedged things in together. I believe these are, I always get this confused. I believe the smaller ones are your tails. And these are your pins. But they both look like tails, so I could be wrong. Wait, I think I drew it wrong. It's where they get confusing. Let's draw it in 3D. Alright, so this is super exaggerated for effect. Then these guys would be the opposite. Yep. I actually think that dovetails are easier to cut than they are to talk about. These would obviously be the same. Tails, pins. So the reason that dovetails get confusing is because you have the angles introduced, right? If you try to do layout, which again is how we mark out a board to know how we're going to cut it. If you try to go into a dovetail, and you've marked everything out on everything, and you blindly cut everything that you've marked, then you're liable to get a really bad fitting dovetail. And that's because we're human and things change. Maybe there's also a lot of arguments about whether you should start on the pins or the tails. I don't think it matters. I think as long as you cut one and then use that to do the layout on the other, you'll be fine. because then you're just fitting whatever you've cut, even if there are errors involved. You're trying to mesh that up with the errors and everything into the other board, and hopefully that keeps it nice and consistent and strong with itself. So what would this look like if we drew this out together? Yes. Down. Back up. Yeah. If this was consistent, then so you'd have end grain, end grain, end grain, end grain, end grain, long grain. It's kind of a bragging right for a lot of woodworkers, because a hand cut dovetail is incredibly impressive. As I mentioned earlier, thanks to modern adhesives, I haven't done the experiments myself, but I don't think it's really that much stronger than a box joint at the end of the day, considering modern adhesives. Don't think it's that much stronger. It is prettier. It's obviously prettier. When you get a box with a nice laid out dovetail set, then it can be really pretty. They make jigs for the router that can cut dovetails essentially for you or aid you through the cutting of dovetails, but that's a very consistent and kind of robotic and manufactured look, and I actually really abhor them. I don't like dovetail jigs because then it's just like trying to elevate the thing, and it's not really providing a better mechanical advantage. It just, I don't know, there's something about the consistency that doesn't look nice to me. Then again, I'm the boy sitting here sketching things, and it's like my idea is the sketch, whatever gets the information is kind of like the key thing. I'm not always super interested in these overly polished things, because I don't personally feel like an overly polished person. So why should I try to put out something that I don't feel is representative or indicative of me, like where I'm coming from? So that all that's to say, you get a box with hand cut dovetails, you get something to where the layout, maybe the tails stay nice and thin. Even that has too much consistency. I would rather see something that's a little bit more considered and spaced out nicely. I went consistent again. But I'd just rather see something that's a little bit more exciting visually, rather than like this type of dovetail, the one that they make router jigs for, or the only router jig I'm familiar with for dovetails, maybe I should say that, is monotonous. It's the same thing ad nauseum. It's no different than a box joint. If I want something to look, or if I want strength out of something, then I'll probably just go with the box joint. Or if I'm really concerned about the way that it looks on the outside, which you should be. I think you should be concerned with the design of a thing. But I would never go with a machined dovetail over a box joint. I'd pick the box joint. If it was really important to me the way that the boards come together, then I'm gonna hand cut a dovetail. That's just the route that I'd go. Looks nicer to me. And it introduces the human variable. Like, I could really screw up on a dovetail. You could see the spots where I would have to go back in and not try to hide my mistakes, but to respond to my missteps in a way that still brings the strength out of the material, and it doesn't leave big gaps in the joint. Because if there's huge gaps in the joint, you're done. Like no glue, no amount of glue in the world is really going to make it look right or make it fit right without having a big spot of yellow glue or, God help you, colored epoxy. God help me. I shouldn't get into the epoxy discussions. Suffice it to say that epoxy is not my favorite thing in the world in its modern use within the world of woodworking. And river tables. Not my thing, but that's okay. It can be your thing, and that's okay. Those are our main joints that I can really think on right now. You have things like, and we're clocking in, we're at 50 minutes here. I should probably start calling it quits because I need to think about getting dinner ready, cooking some supper. I think we're going to have some fish, so I need to thaw it out, get it thawed out. You have things like Domino's, not the pizza, Domino's and biscuits. Neither one of these are edible in the wood world. I mean, I guess you could eat it, but you're literally eating wood. Domino's are just essentially a smaller version of mortise and tenons. They are cut with what is called a floating tenon, which means you have two mortises cut in boards in each piece you're trying to join together, and you put a little bit of tenon stock down to connect those. And that's the way that things get brought together. So you got the mortise and tenons, and Domino's biscuits are a variation to where usually they're just used not as a mechanical thing, but as a registration, which just helps to keep boards together. I should have mentioned just long grain to long grain. It's technically a joint. Let's throw it in real quick. Long grain to long grain. Do do boop boop do boop 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 do do. So long grain is just if you had two long grain boards, you can just glue long grain back to long grain. It's wild, but you can just pop those two boards together, put glue between them, pop them together, glue them up. That is going to be just as strong as anything else when it comes to joining long grain boards together. As a matter of fact, most times if you were to do a kind of like long grain glue up, if you were to try to break that board, you'd probably break your hand. But if it ever fails, it will likely fail across the grain and not across your adhesion. Again, because our modern adhesives are so stinking strong. So long grain to long grain is great. Whole lot of fun. Not really. I feel like this has another name. Panel glue ups. Gluing up panels. Maybe call it a panel glue up. But that's nice and strong. Again, my absolute favorite of all these is the mortise and tenon. I don't know why. I haven't really examined it much. Never really felt the need to. I greatly miss woodworking. I just don't really have room to get set up with doing too awful much right here. Don't have a whole lot of porch room to get up doing a whole lot. Obviously, even if there were, if I had a studio through like a maker space or something, if I had studio space, that would be closed right now. So I'm making it, you're making it, we're making it. Let's hang in there. Maybe once this is all over, then I can find a way to start getting back into getting my hand on some materials and getting a little bit more involved with it. I do have some like small, just like popsicle sticks, craft sticks that I've glued up a little bit just to start playing around with in here. I've got my wood burner, but that's a different thing. That's more akin to illustration than it is to actual being able to make something out of wood, which I quite enjoy. So that is clocking us in at 55 minutes. I'm going to call it here. Hope that you've had a good day. Hope that you're having a good day. But continue to have a good day. Hope to see you tomorrow. All that fun. Stay safe. Stay healthy. That's all I got, guys. Have a good day.